Kia ora, this is Liz. Welcome to Dames Ablaze. If this is the first time you've stumbled across my channel, I suggest you go have a look at the introduction video so you know what's going on. If you are a repeat performer, can I ask that you give me a like? If you like it at the end of the video, that helps the algorithm to feed it to more people, and also subscribe if you have not already. Right, and for those of you that know what's going on, grab your Bible, we'll dig on in. We are moving into John chapter 6 today. You know, John's 6th chapter has 71 verses, so we're going to be in this chapter for quite some time to come. This morning we are looking at chapters 1 to 7, and I will read them to you now if I can find them. Here we go. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. And Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread, that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. So this is the only miracle recorded in all four Gospels if you discount Jesus' own resurrection. John's retelling gives us the detail of the conversation with Philip, and it's the only one to mention that it's near Passover. And John calls it a sign, which makes it the fourth one in the group of 7 that John records, and is therefore the middle sign. It is a bit of a pivotal one. The previous 3 had been slightly private. This one was fully public and could not be hushed up or explained away. So let's dig in a little. John starts by stating after these things, which could make you think it's a direct link to the previous debate with the Pharisees. But a comparison with the other Gospels tells us that it's around a year later. In the timeline of events, John the Baptist has just been beheaded, and the 12 have recently returned from the mission that Jesus sent them on. But don't lose sight of how John has placed it in his Gospel. He's done it deliberately because he wants you to be thinking about Moses, whom he just mentioned in the previous chapter. Right? After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Now, John adds that detail in all likelihood because the town of Tiberias, which when Jesus was walking around had only just been finished, was a much more prominent place by the time John wrote his Gospel, and the lake had become known by that new title. John gives both titles as he intends his work to be applicable to both Jews and Gentiles. Actually, the Sea of Galilee has had 4 names throughout its history. The other 2 are the Lake of Gennesaret and the old Hebrew name, which is either Chinnereth or Chinneroth, and I probably butchered the pronunciation there. Both of those words have a root meaning lyre. Do you remember what a lyre is? It's that old small harp-like guitar-y kind of instrument. It's kind of a odd shape. If you look at the lake from above, it does bear a resemblance to that particular musical instrument, which could be how it got its name, although I'm not entirely sure how they would have seen the shape of the lake from above back in the day. Anyway, Gennesaret was the more modern pronunciation of the Hebrew name, which I am not going to try and pronounce again. The lake is 700 feet below sea level, making it the lowest lake in the world. It has many hills surrounding it, which explains why it's often hit by sudden violent storms, such as the one that will assail the disciples once they've finished here. Jesus is going across this sea, which is not unusual. He seems to cross it quite a lot, really. It kind of makes the journey from the town surrounding the lake quicker, I suppose. John does supply you with the reason for this particular lake crossing. Doesn't supply you, but the other Gospels do. When the team got back from their mission, Jesus told them they needed to have a break. So they got into the boat to cross to the other side and try and get some time away from the crowd. Unfortunately, a great crowd followed him. A large body of people watched when Jesus and the disciples departed one shore, and they, according to Matthew and Mark, followed Jesus on foot around the shoreline till they gathered round him and the disciples when they alighted on the other side. So much for a time of rest, and obviously the boat trip didn't take much off the simple trip walking around the edge did. So, John keys you in on the reason the people are following Jesus, and it's not for his stunning good looks. According to John, they followed him because they saw the signs which he performed on those who were diseased. So, the word saw here means to gaze at, behold, experience, discern, or even partake of. It's the root of our word theatre, and it can mean to gaze on for the purpose of working something out. It seems the people had worked something out about Jesus. They worked out that Jesus could perform miracles, and they want more. Understandable. In an age where medicine was in its infancy and most diseases of the day were incurable and often meant you couldn't attend temple. The greatness of the crowd can be explained by the death of John and the disciples' mission. Jesus' name is now a lot more well known, and those that had been following John the Baptizer would possibly have turned to Jesus as the next best thing. Mark calls them sheep without a shepherd. It's hard to determine where the healing of all these people takes place. According to Mark, Jesus teaches them and makes no mention of healing or where they are. According to Luke, they were in the town of Bethsaida. But then later in his record, he tells us that the disciples urged Jesus to send the people away because they're in a deserted place. Now, Bethsaida may not have been a big place, but it's a bit rude to call it a deserted place. Matthew's record appears to have the healing taking place on the shoreline, whereas John's has them up a mountain. Consensus in the scholarly fields has not been reached, which means the site of the feeding has not been decided upon. There are at this time 3 possible sites: Targa, Hippos, and a coastal area south of Bethsaida. It is one of the questions yet to be answered where harmonizing the Gospels is concerned. As I said, John has them heading into the mountains. Potentially, this is after they've spent the day healing on the shoreline. All of the other Gospels have them feeding taking place at the end of the day. John does not mention the time of day, so this is highly likely, and it would make sense for them to move away from the shore for the evening, right? But there's another possible reason why John sends them up a mountain. There's a biblical figure that John is alluding to here, someone else in the Bible who met with God on a mountain. Now, that would be Moses. There are others who met with God on a mountain, but it's Moses I'm thinking of. Which is why John's Gospel went from the discussion Jesus was having with the Pharisees, including the bit about Moses and trusting in him, to this story, leaving out the year or so in between. Now Moses, in case you don't know, and you probably do, was Israel's greatest prophet. He led them out of slavery, saved them from thirst and hunger, put himself before God as a willing sacrifice when the people seriously screwed up with the golden calf. There are elements of Moses in this story that John has laid down as foundational strokes to the broader picture. Jesus goes up a mountain, much like Moses did. Actually, Moses went up a mountain 7 or 8 times. Moses went up the mountain to meet with God. Jesus, as God, is on the mountain, and the people are gathering round him. Do you see the brush strokes? He went up this mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. And then John tells you it's near Passover. Why does he do that? Again, there are those brush strokes of Moses. Passover was when the slaves left Egypt. Moses at the head of them. Ahead of a huge band of people who gather round him to hear the word of the Lord and be fed. Is any of this making an impact? Are you getting a vague picture? So, back into John then. Jesus lifts up his eyes and seeing a great multitude coming toward him. Jesus and the disciples left the crowd on the shore, but here they are streaming toward them. But why does John say Jesus lifts his head? Possibly because of what the disciples say. In the other 3 Gospels, we're told that the disciples tell Jesus to dismiss the crowd because the place is desolate, meaning there's no food and there's nowhere to buy food. They're obviously hungry, don't you think? It's been a long day. They're tired. Food is on their minds. And then they see the crowds and then they start to get a little antsy. So is it Jesus who mentions food as it appears in John, or is it the disciples as it appears in the other Gospels? Here's how I think it went down. Jesus takes his disciples up into the hills to separate them from the crowd and to get the rest that he said they needed. The crowd refused to leave, and after the boys say to Jesus, "You should send them away," he looks up and he sees them all streaming up the mountain. And then he responds. John doesn't mention any of this, of course, but he doesn't need to. The other three have covered it well enough. Instead, he goes straight to Jesus looking up. And what we see then is Jesus looking up to watch as the crowd come up the mountain. Another brushstroke from Exodus, but this time it's a very different response to the one God got when Moses was in charge. So let's have a look at what happened when Moses was in charge, right? We're going to travel back to just after Moses has been up the mountain and received the first spoken rendition of the 10 Commandments. They're not written on tablets of stone yet. Moses is sent down the mountain to reiterate the command of God that they weren't to try and come up onto the mountain. But God needn't have bothered with that command, because this is the response that Moses gets, right? This is Exodus 20, 18 to 19. When all the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the sounding of the ram's horn, and the mountain enveloped in smoke, they trembled and stood at a distance. "Speak to us yourself and we will listen," they said to Moses, "but don't let God speak to us, or we will die." Such bravery. They were so freaked out, they didn't even want to hear God speak. But here, with Jesus, with that manifest presence of God amongst them, they have no problem coming up the mountain to listen to him. So Jesus sees them all coming up. The disciples have told them to dismiss the crowd, but Jesus has a better plan. "You give them something to eat," he said, which isn't recorded in John's narrative. Instead, John concentrates on how Jesus responds, right? He turns to Philip and he asks him, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" Why Philip? Many commentators tell us that Philip was from the area, and so he was the obvious one to ask. But here's the thing. Back in chapter 1, when we got our intro to a few of the disciples, we were told in verse 44 that Philip was from the city of Bethsaida, but then again, we're also told so were Peter and Andrew. I'll ask again, why Philip? Verse 6 answers the question for you. It was to test him. What then was the nature of this test? The word test means to make proof of, to attempt, to try, to tempt. It can be a positive or a negative thing. So what is it that Jesus is trying to get Philip to see about himself? For surely Jesus already knows, right? Well, we don't know much about Philip. The other Gospels only mention him in the lists of the 12. Only John gives us any details. We were introduced to him in the first chapter, as I've already mentioned. There we were told he lived in Bethsaida, the same place as Andrew and Peter, and therefore it is assumed, probably rightly, that they knew each other. We don't know if he has any occupation. In fact, we have so little information, it's hard to know what Jesus may have been testing Philip for with this question. But let's take a quick look at the other times Philip turns up in John's Gospel and see if that helps at all. So John 12, 20 to 22 says this. "Now there were certain Greeks amongst those who came up to worship at the feast. Then they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, just in case you missed it, and asked him, saying, 'Sir, we wish to see Jesus.' Philip came and told Andrew, and in turn Andrew and Philip told Jesus." Okay, it's not a lot to go on. Why did the Greeks approach Philip? Perhaps he spoke Greek, or dressed in the style of the Greeks. Perhaps he was just the first disciple they came across. John's next mention of him is in chapter 14, where he says in verses 8 to 9, so they're at dinner, Philip said to him being Jesus, "Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us." And Jesus said to him, "Have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" Again, not a lot to go on. Philip appears to still not fully understand who Jesus was. This particular one is in the last week of the ministry, potentially even at the Last Supper, although there is some debate about that one, but it's a rabbit hole we'll get to in another year. So he should have had some idea by then anyway. Philip should have had some idea by then, and like I said, it's not a lot to go on. There is a Philip mentioned in the 6th book of Acts who's chosen to be a deacon, but most scholars say this can't be Philip the Apostle. Verse 2 tells you the 12 summoned the other disciples, and Philip is chosen from that group. The same Philip is mentioned in Acts 21, and there he's called one of the 7, which is how that particular group of deacons were referred to. He's also called Philip the Evangelist, perhaps to separate him from Philip the Apostle. There is another mention of a Philip in chapters 8 of Acts, which speaks of him going to Samaria. However, this would again appear to not be the apostle, based on verse 1 of that chapter, which says, at that time a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Philip's trip to Samaria comes hot on the heels of this persecution, so it would seem then that he wasn't the apostle. Many also state that it's not likely to be the deacon based on the fact that this could mean he couldn't do the job for which he was picked, which is a valid argument, but the counter to it would be they'd all been scattered, so no one was doing their job. If we accept that the Philip in Caesarea is the same person based on the moniker one of the 7, then the Philip who evangelizes the Ethiopian treasurer is also likely to be the same man as he ends up in Caesarea. This looks like case closed for this all being Philip the Apostle. But then the full title of the book of Acts is actually the Acts of the Apostles, and it sounds kind of odd to me that that would include the acts of a deacon / evangelist. Not impossible, just odd. Also, there is a piece of information outside of the Bible from Papias of Hierapolis, which was an old city in what's now called Turkey. So he was a historian from the 2nd century who'd actually spoken to John, as attested to by St. Irenaeus and Eusebius. He wrote that the Philip of Acts 21 was one of the apostles, and Polycarp, who was a 2nd century bishop in Ephesus, said that Philip, one of the 12, so that would be the apostles, was buried at Hierapolis alongside his 2 older virgin daughters, and that a 3rd daughter was buried at Ephesus. This again seems to link Philip the Apostle to the one mentioned in Acts 21, because there it mentions him having 3 virgin daughters. It would seem then that according to those specific ancient fathers that Philip mentioned, that the Philip mentioned throughout the book of Acts may well be Philip the Apostle. It's one of those debates that's ongoing, possibly will not be solved until or unless further evidence comes to light. I wouldn't like to say, really, and I wouldn't build a doctrine on any of that speculation. And all of that speculation does not help us much with our question, right? Which was, what was the nature of the test that Jesus has set before Philip and asking him, where shall we buy bread? The word for buy literally means to go to a market and purchase. So which market shall we go to, Philip? We could say it that way. But how is that a test? Other than just working out where in the city a market is. It could be that what Jesus is trying out here is whether or not Philip will admit that they can't provide enough bread. And if that is the test, and Philip passes it with flying colours. You see, it's not a test in the way we think of a test. A test in our minds is something we either pass or we fail, right? But a test in Jesus's world was a way of trying something to see how good it is, to see what worth it holds. We should look at these biblical tests more in the sense of testing metal to work out its strength than someone failing. Therefore, what Jesus is doing here is trying Philip to see who he is and what he has learned so far. Philip was quick to recognize the possibility of Jesus being the Messiah in the very beginning. That's what he rushed up to Nathanael and said. He said, "We have found him, of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." This was long before Jesus had done much of anything. Philip at that point was relying more on the baptizer's testimony and maybe some knowledge of the prophecies from the Old Testament. He wasn't relying on signs or miracles. Philip was quick to jump on the bandwagon, but how was he getting halfway through this journey? How much has he learned? How far has his faith come? These are the possible tests that Jesus is working with. So John tells you it's a test, right? Because Jesus knew what he was going to do. He wasn't really looking for a solution to the problem. He already had a solution, but he still seeks to test, and perhaps in that test teach Philip something. Philip's answer is seen by some as being quite mercenary. They suggest that Philip looked out, assessed the number of people, worked out how much bread they would need, and come up with a roundabout number. That seems a little unlikely to me. I don't think Philip was doing exact mathematical equations here. He was just using a phrase to basically say it was impossible. My feeling is that there is a lack of hope here, a sense of being overwhelmed. Right? Philip looks out over the crowd, shakes his head, and says, in essence, "There's no way we can afford to buy them all food. It would take 200 denarii." A denarii was the common amount for a day's wages back in the day. 200 denarii, 200 days. In today's money, if we go with the minimum wage here in New Zealand, which is around $22.70 an hour, if we multiply that by 200, we get a little over $4,500. So it's a substantial amount of money. Despite what some scholars say, I don't believe Philip is literally thinking they'll be going to the shops and buying all this bread. He's merely commenting on the fact that the task before them is an impossible one. He has yet to realize he's sitting next to the one who can do the impossible. Let's head back into Moses' story for a bit, right? Because there's some stuff hiding in here. We're going to look at Numbers 11. So the people are out in the wilderness and they're complaining, surprise, surprise, about the lack of meat. Moses starts getting a little fed up and goes to complain to the Lord about them all, and God accepts that and tells him to get the men to consecrate themselves because he's going to feed them so much meat they're going to be sick. So we're going to read Numbers 11, 18 to 23. Then you shall say to the people, "Sanctify yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, Who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have despised the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, Why did we ever come up out of Egypt? And Moses said, The people whom I am among are 600,000 men on foot. Yet you have said, I will give them meat, that they may eat for a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to provide enough for them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to provide enough for them? And the Lord said to Moses, Has the Lord's arm been shortened? Now you shall see whether my word will befall you or not. Does this have a similar feel to Philip's statement? Yeah, it does. But I don't think Philip is angry like I think Moses was. I think Philip's feeling tired and possibly overwhelmed. Moses may well have been feeling the same way, but he reacted to that stress a little differently. Think about it, right? From Philip's perspective, it's been a busy day. There have been many people coming and going. They only just arrived back from their missionary trip. They're all tired. That's why Jesus tried to get them away from the crowds in the first place. Philip is worn out, and this request of Jesus tires him even more. So he doesn't really answer the question well. It's not a carefully constructed mathematical equation. It's just a slightly hopeless reply of a tired individual who can barely think. What answer do you suppose Jesus would have preferred? Remember, Philip's been with Jesus since the start, which means he was there at the wedding at Cana when the water became wine. Shouldn't he have some sense that Jesus can do what he's about to do? Should he not have anticipated a miracle at this point? It's impossible to say, isn't it? When he asks Jesus on that last night to show them the Father, it's fairly obvious that he still has a long way to go to get full understanding. Jesus' reply at that conversation is a little snippy when you think about it. Have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who's seen me has seen the Father, so how can you say, show us the Father? In much the same way, the Lord replied to Moses, Has the Lord's arm been shortened? Now you shall see whether my word will befall you or not. Moses should have known better, of course. I mean, you don't accuse a God who made a dry bridge through the middle of the Red Sea whether or not he can provide meat. Neither should Philip have had a problem working out where they would get bread. Still, they're both humans, aren't they? And humans often miss the point, especially when we're tired. So Philip didn't answer well. But what are we to take from this test of his? What would have been a better reply, do you think? Maybe, I don't know, Jesus, but you do. That would work, wouldn't it? So perhaps the lesson for us is to remember that when we're feeling overwhelmed, tired, dispirited, when the task at hand seems beyond us, perhaps we should say what Philip should have said. I don't know, Lord, but I know that you can provide. That is the end of this lesson for this week. I'm sorry it's slightly longer, I think. Yes, definitely slightly longer. I pray blessings over you and your household and over your endeavours this week, and pray that we will see you all again next week. In Jesus' name, amen. Ka kite.